Hello, this is your host, Dan Zapansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. On November 30th, 1989, in Florida, a man was shot 4 times by a naked, hard-faced, blonde prostitute. He suffered a slow, agonizing death, while the woman stripped him of his valuables and drove his Cadillac back to the motel where her lesbian lover was waiting. In 1990, her killing spree kicked into high gear, with 3 men slain in 3 weeks. Of the 6 of 7 male victims whose bodies were found, some were nude. All had been robbed and shot dead. In January 1991, pawnshop records led to the arrest of Aileen Carol Wournos, a.k.a. Lee, an abusive alcoholic man-hater with a murderous hairtrigger temper. Tired of turning $20 tricks and often being abused, Wournos decided to rob her customers of everything they had, including their lives. Her arrest and trial prompted a worldwide media frenzy and even an Academy Award-winning movie, Monster. In the end, Wournos received 6 separate death sentences. Lethal Intent is the definitive account of a killer who confounded the profiling experts, forever changing their concepts of the crimes of which a woman is capable. My guest today is journalist and author Sue Russell, discussing her true crime classic, Lethal Intent, the shocking true story of one of America's most notorious female serial killers. Welcome to the program, Sue Russell, and thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure, and I'm sure our audience is as well.
I hope so.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I'm certain. Now, first off, this is a question that always intrigues me, and I always ask it of all guests. You are, to give you a little bit of a background to our audience, you're an internationally syndicated journalist and author, a past editor of Woman Magazine, and a regular contributor to various British and U.S. publications. You've written about the beauty industry and co-authored Star Mothers, the mums behind the celebrities. Now, what was it about the Aileen Wournos case, because you've written about so many diverse cases, what was it about the Aileen Wournos case specifically that compelled you to write not only Lethal Intent, but also Damsel of Death, both about Aileen Wournos? What was it about Aileen Wournos and her case that interested you so much?
Well, I'd written a lot of crime stories and features on related issues about crime, and I was dying to write a true crime book, no pun intended. And the minute I heard about Aileen, of course my ears pricked up, because it was such an extraordinary case. It was such an amazing piece of news that was coming across the wires, this woman being arrested with all these casualties of her at the end of her .22 caliber gun, and it was in modern day times unprecedented, and she defied the definitions of a serial killer, as outlined by the FBI. So it just seemed crazy not to just immediately jump up and say, okay, this is the one. I have to write this book. I felt very much interested in women's violence. I'd written about women as victims of violence, and this was just too good to pass up in terms of being such a fascinating story, Dan.
Right. Now, I'm a little bit confused. Maybe you can tell our audience. You wrote Damsel of Death and also Lethal Intent. Are they 2 separate books? Tell us
I'm glad you asked that, because it does confuse people somewhat. What happened was I wrote Damsel of Death first for England and Australia. As you may be able to tell, I don't know if I have any of my accent left. I am a native Londoner. And so the book came out over there first, and due to various publishing industry hiccups, it didn't come out here until after 2000. What was it? 2002, I think.
Right.
And at that point, they put another title on it. It was exactly the same book, but I updated it with her 10 years on death row at the end. So Lethal Intent is definitely the one if anyone's interested in getting hold of the book, because it does go right up to, the point of her execution.
Yeah, okay. That clarifies that. I was interested to know about that.
Yes,
It would seem unusual that you would write two separate books about the same thing.
Right.
Now, I understand that you've spent some 2 years researching the life of Aileen Wournos. It is a fascinating story just on its own. Let's go back. What was Aileen Wournos' early life like growing up in Troy, Michigan, just outside of the city of Detroit?
Right. Just to clarify, I didn't spend 2 years researching it. I spent 2 years researching and writing it. I don't want people to think I'm the slowest person in the Western Hemisphere. Aileen was born to Diane Wournos, who was briefly married to Leo Pittman. They were both very young, and this was in Troy, Michigan. And basically what happened is first there was the brother Keith, who's about 11 months older than Aileen, and then Aileen was born, by which time Leo Pittman had exited the picture. And within the first 2 years of Eileen's life, her mother abandoned her twice, dumping her and Keith on the grandparents, Britta and Lowry Wournos, also in the Troy, Michigan area there. And so she left the babies with the grandparents once, and then she came back and tried to make a go of it, but that didn't work, and so she took off twice. So for anyone who believes, that abandonment during that very early formative stage is a powerful influence on a person's future, then I think you could say that Aileen had a double dose of it.
Right.
The grandparents then raised Aileen and Keith as their own, and alongside their own children, Diane's brothers, Barry and Laurie. So it was Barry and Laurie and Aileen and Keith, as if they were all siblings, although in fact Barry and Laurie were aunt and uncle to Aileen and Keith. I hope I'm making sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was a rough childhood. It was a hard scrabble Michigan life, but Laurie Wournos, Lowry, I'm sorry, the father, we called him Lowry to try to distinguish from Laurie, the daughter. But Lowry Wournos was generally recognized in the neighborhood as a mean man, and neighbors would hear the kids getting a whipping from across the backyards and what have you, and hear screaming and carrying on. The shades were always drawn. They were a very private family. It was one of those cases of what is going on behind closed doors. And school kids who went to school with her would always said when I interviewed them years later, that they always assumed that bad things were happening and it was not a happy place to be living. But they kept all of it very much hidden. And grandmother, Britta, was also, it later was revealed, an alcoholic and was drinking heavily behind closed doors too. So you've got two drinking grandparents, and you've got the violence from the grandfather, who would take a belt to the kids, especially Aileen, who was always in trouble with them. And, he'd pull down their jeans or whatever and just take the leather belt to them and actually make Aileen polish it up before she got a whipping. So it was a whole procedure, and I'm sure had a bad effect on her outlook on life in general. It was child abuse, certainly would be considered child abuse today. In those days it was not so terribly unusual, or at least it was perhaps a more violent version of what's not so terribly unusual. It wasn't unusual to hit your kids back then.
Now, when you talk about effect, certainly in a negative effect, in this case, we will reveal in this interview, that this is an exceptional case for all the factors that led to her shaping her eventual character and eventual behavior. And we talk about the parents, and were Aileen and Keith told about who their parents actually were, or anything about their actual real parents, and if right. and when were they told? At what age were they told given this actual information, the real identity of the actual parents?
Aileen was about 12 years old, and she was crushed, completely crushed. She was in disbelief, basically. And what is so interesting to me, or was, initially so stunningly interesting to me, Dan, was that when I began looking into Leo Pittman's background, the birth father, not only was he a petty criminal and, stole cars and things like that, but when I eventually got his records from the FBI and learned about what he had done a bit later on, he had abducted a child into his car. He'd lurked outside a schoolyard, and he'd taken this little girl, I think she was maybe 7, and he'd driven her across state lines, and he had sexually abused her, and he then put her in the car, and he drove her back across and dropped her off outside the school. Now, because she'd gone across state lines, albeit marginally, it became a federal offense. And the father of Aileen also committed a capital crime. He, too, faced the death penalty, like his daughter, and they never met. And he didn't get the death penalty, and ultimately he hanged himself in prison. But I just find that so eerie and uncanny a coincidence, or maybe more than a coincidence, that their lives took these turns. And the child who was instrumental in the victim in putting Leo Pittman behind bars had to go into court to testify that this was the man who'd abducted and raped her. And when she was shown the fabric from the seat of his car, which was a distinctive check pattern, she broke out in hives in front of the whole courtroom, so everyone could see this immediate physical reaction she had just to seeing the car seat material from Leo Pittman's car. But Leo tried to play the system too, saying he was mentally ill, he spent time in the mental hospital, he spent time in the prison part. He tried to work the system, and he did in fact hang himself.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you talk about the environmental, the effect of the environment on a future killer. This case is I would think, a textbook case in terms of what not to do and what not to do with a child.
Yes, I mean, I always liken it to stacking up dominoes, standing them up on their end in a long row before they all begin to tip over, and they suddenly reach their tipping point. It was like everything that was a part of her life was a strike against her. She had some hearing difficulties, which manifested themselves as learning difficulties. In fact, she just needed a hearing aid, and the grandmother sort of refused to accept this and didn't get her the necessary help, and kind of dismissed it when teachers noted this kind of thing. And one teacher actually wrote a report saying something like, this girl is going to, I've forgotten the wording, it's been so long, I'm sorry, but, more or less like, this girl is going, to end up in major trouble if somebody doesn't intervene. And of course nobody did, but eventually those dominoes all kind of cumulatively, the weight of them just tipped over, and it almost feels inevitable when you look at the fact she was taking money for sex when she was age 11 or 12. Boys who were in the neighborhood at that time and who are now men testified to me, well, didn't testify, but they told me in interviews that they'd had sex with her when she was 11. She had sex with her brother. She took money for sex. She would charge 35 cents or a packet of cigarettes. She was called the cigarette pig, the cigarette bandit. These kids had a fort, and they would have make-out sessions, and nobody wanted to kiss Aileen. You can imagine, the rejection and the pain that was building and the rage that was building in this girl through adolescence. And she would use this money that she got from sex also to party with her friends. She so badly wanted friends, and she so badly wanted to build these friendships that she saw all around her, but that seemed to elude her. And so she'd throw parties and what have you. But the trouble was she had this explosive temper. And as I write about in Lethal Intent, basically she sabotaged every friendship she had because other kids were afraid of Aileen. She would have this extraordinary explosion from time to time, much to the embarrassment of sister/aunt Laurie, who really tried to stand up for Aileen, but at times it became impossible and unbearable. Barry was a bit older and was out of the house, so Laurie was more in the thick of it. But it was very tough because Aileen clearly longed for these connections, but just was unable to rein in these demons inside her long enough to sustain anything.
What I found was interesting too, in continuum with just with her environment, you also, or at least she had said, and I don't know if this was corroborated. You can tell us who actually said this, and if there was any corroboration of this. It said that I think Aileen had said that her father said she was wicked, evil, worthless, should never have been born, and she was not worthy of the air that she breathed.
Yeah.
Was that proven that those kind of statements came from her adopted father?
I think that was a mixture of what was told by close family friends, by Aileen herself. Laurie, the sister aunt, was a little reticent when it came to painting her father with this nasty, nasty brush that everybody else did. I think she was rather in denial, but she did admit that, yes, we got whippings, and yes, he did shout at Aileen and Keith. They were always in trouble. So it was a combination of people, including Aileen herself, who talked about this verbal abuse, which was ongoing for a long time, and obviously very destructive.
You also talk about that Aileen Lee Wournos also developed a liking for drugs and alcohol.
Yes.
And how did this play into her eventual acceleration in her behavior getting worse eventually? Mm-hmm. What was the role of alcohol and drugs in that?
Well, there were several elements running concurrently. She was getting into so much trouble. I mean, she got pregnant when she was 14 and went into a home and gave birth, and the baby was taken away from her when she was just past 15, 15th birthday. So we have the drinking and the drugs. We have her being essentially ostracized from then on by Lowry, who basically kicked her out of the house more than once. She did go back, but eventually she didn't go back. And she lived in cars, in campers, in people's driveways. She lived it rough. And needless to say, I'm quite certain that drugs and alcohol played quite a role in the road she then took, because she basically never really pursued any kind of jobs, or she lived rough. She prostituted herself, and I've always believed, Aileen always denied that she did drugs in the later part of her life, and certainly I know that when she was with her lover Tyria Moore, they would knock off a 48 pack of beer in an evening. But Aileen always denied the drugs. Now, the drugs were very prevalent during the teenage years, and unless someone actually actively goes into AA and says, I'm going to clean up my act, and gives up the drugs, living the life she did, the prostitution, the living on the streets, the homeless, the going from one place to another, I personally find it very hard to believe, and always did, that she didn't continue to do drugs. She had certain things that to her were not acceptable. She would admit to the drinking, and I believe she did the drugs and didn't admit to them, in much the same way that she had no problem admitting to having killed the men, but she had a problem saying she'd been sexually abused. In her mind, one was shameful, the other was not. And I think that the drugs were there. That would be my, it can only be a guess because she would never confirm it. But, people pay for sex with drugs, as you know, and she was living a very rough life for a very long time.
Right. Now, you mentioned her lover, her lesbian lover, Tyra.
Yes.
And Tyra Moore. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Tyra and the event that intersected these two people's lives forever, where they met, how they met, and how they became a couple. And tell us a little bit about Tyra Moore first.
Well, Tyra was actually the more industrious of the two. She did have a definite liking for partying and drinking beer and, generally getting wasted regularly. However, she did hold down jobs. She was a hotel maid and, various other jobs that she had for periods of time. And she would go off to work and leave Aileen. Aileen would then take off up the highway with her, what the police would call, and, I guess I would too, given what was in it, her kill bag, which was bottle of Windex and her gun, and she would go off hooking. And, there's some dispute really about how much was openly told to Tyra at what point. There's no doubt that Tyra knew she was prostituting herself, but Tyra was the type who really liked the end product and didn't want to rock the boat too much. It was easier for her to turn a blind eye and just take the rewards, as it were, of what came of Eileen's lifestyle. They met in a bar and they began drinking and they went home together. At the time, Tyra was living with Cammie Green, a friend of hers, and Cammie's husband and children. And they woke up one morning and Tyra had a woman in her room, and Cammie tried to go in at some point, and she was told, no, get away. And basically they spent the weekend together, locked up together in that room, coming out just occasionally to get more alcohol or whatever. However, Dan, I must tell you that contrary to what everybody else believes, I do not believe that Aileen was a lesbian. I believe that I interviewed enough former boyfriends and people with whom she had sex where there was no money exchanged, men I'm talking about. I believe with Aileen, Tyra, I call her Tyria, you call her Tyra. Many people call her Tyra. Tyria was an emotional prop. It was what Aileen so badly craved, that emotional connection. Their sex life dropped off pretty quickly, and although Aileen did have one other, to our knowledge, lesbian affair, basically she was often in love with men and often had sex with men. So I've always, gone against this man-hating lesbian label always given to her by the press. I don't believe that was the case. I don't believe she was a lesbian. She was bisexual, perhaps, but she certainly enjoyed sex with men and instigated it when she didn't have to.
Yes, she was the act of love, somebody actually wanting her, seemed to be the main compulsion and drive in her life.
Yes.
Regardless of who it was. Yes.
Now, when they lived in a trailer together, Aileen put tin foil, what do you call it, aluminum foil, they call it in the States aluminium foil in England, at the windows of the trailer. And basically, she didn't want Tyra doing anything. She preferred her to be at home, waiting for her and available to her at all times. She was quite controlling in that regard, and, she liked to keep very close tabs on her. And over writing the book and working a very complex, intricate timeline, I did eventually come to my own conclusion about what the FBI would call was the precipitating event that preceded each of these murders. And it was very closely tied into her borderline personality. And the best way I can describe borderline personality is with the title of a book on the condition, which is called I hate you, don't leave me, or something like that. But in other words, it's the dichotomy between the anger and the wanting someone to stay with you, but then also telling them that you hate them, and just black and white kind of behavior.
Sure.
So where was I going with all that, Dan? So I think she had this borderline personality disorder, and I do believe that a big part of borderline personality is a massive fear of abandonment. It's just like a life-ruling fear. And she so lived in fear of abandonment. She'd been abandoned so many times, let's face it, and let down so many times. So when she found Tyria, and Tyria stuck with her even after Tyria knew she'd committed the first murder, of course this was incredibly powerful for her, and it meant everything to her.
Certainly. Now, you talked about the precipitating event. Well, let's get to that. They are in Daytona Beach. They're in Florida together.
Yeah.
At some point, Aileen Wournos goes from robbing her clients or taking money from her clients to killing them. You talked about a precipitating event. Is there a precipitating event that caused this, that you found out, you discovered, was that moment, that reason, that event that precipitated her first murder?
Well, I believe so. And of course, remember that although she confessed to 7 murders and was convicted of 6, we don't 100% know that those were her only murders.
Right.
I personally think she may have witnessed another murder at a different time in her life, which is a bit convoluted, so I won't go into it right here and now. But Thanksgiving 1989, Ty had brought home a girl called Sandy for Thanksgiving dinner who was a co-worker of hers at the hotel. And she was a very pretty blonde straight girl, and I interviewed her, And Thanksgiving dinner was an extremely awkward event. Aileen, they had basically TV dinner style Thanksgiving dinners. Aileen would not eat in front of the other two. And she clearly was very, very jealous of Sandy. And when's Thanksgiving, I don't know, but, within 2 days after this event, which I think rocked her world because she really thought Ty was in love with Sandy, and although she knew Sandy had a husband, I believe it was at that point, or certainly a live-in boyfriend, this didn't cut it with Aileen. She was terribly badly affected by the presence of this pretty young blonde thing, and felt very, very threatened. So I believe that was the trigger for the first one, and the fact that she also somehow established that these men had a certain amount of cash on them, i.e. more than $20, because with one exception, the 7 men had several $100s on them in cash, which in her world was quite a lot of money. And I think that she somehow established that through conversation with them. And then that played into her targeting certain men. But to reinforce what I was saying about, why she killed and when Ty's sister came down from Ohio for a vacation with them, Aileen killed, I think it was 3 men in 6 weeks. I believe I have that right. It was, or was it? Yeah, 3 weeks. I don't know, because the sister went home early. But anyway, there was a terrible clash. The sister wanted Ty to move back up to Ohio, and during that period of time, 3 men died in very short order, and Aileen would come home waving the dollar bills, $100 bills, whatever, and would say, look what I have, I've got all this money, we can party, we can go to SeaWorld, we can this, we can that, and she was desperately afraid that Ty was going to go home to Ohio with the sister. Again, the abandonment issue kicked in. And I believe that she robbed to get the money, which she felt, as it had done all her life, she would be able to avoid being abandoned by having money. She'd be able to buy herself company, which is really what she did with those kids as a teenager, with all the money in the parties, and again with Ty by coming home with this money, which Ty, frankly, was drawn in by, and so it went on. But that's the most dramatic example, is why 3 men were killed in such a short space of time, when the sister was visiting, and I really believe it was all tied into that fear of abandonment. And she was very methodical about it, and this is why I took issue with the film Monster. Great issue. In fact, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about the film, because in the film, which I don't know if you've seen it, Dan, but it's...
Yes, I have, yeah.
She's brutally raped, and she kills her attacker to save her own life. Well, that's actually not what happened, and it's a very different story, and it's the wrong story, and you're not learning anything about Aileen Wournos by believing that to be the story, because she wasn't a woman who killed to save her own life during a rape. That first victim, Richard Mallory, was found sitting behind the wheel of his car, fully clothed. Something had set her off for sure, but it wasn't. When Aileen was first arrested, she didn't come out with a lot of the stuff that came out at her trial later about how Richard Mallory had raped her in every which way possible, anally raped her and what have you, tied her to the steering wheel with electrical cables, inserted rubbing alcohol into her bodily orifices. When the murder had taken place, Aileen took the car, as you know, but the other thing is, before she left, she took Mallory and she wrapped him in a bit of old carpet that was lying out there in the woods and hid his body. Now, his pockets were turned inside out, so she'd gone through his pockets to see what else he had on him. Now, to me, if you're being brutally raped and you are trying to save your own life, do you really stop to, go through the man's pockets and once you've killed him and cover his body with a rug? You'd run. She did run eventually when she'd taken care of all this, hiding the body. She took the car, and then she also separately hid what else was in the car, which was vodka and orange juice, glasses, what have you. But there was no rubbing alcohol. There were no electrical ties. The other evidence was never there. And she didn't come out with this story until she got on the witness stand, She'd had a long time to think about what her story was going to be. But in actual fact, the evidence is that the first bullet went into Richard Mallory from the passenger seat. He was fully dressed behind the steering wheel. You will admit that paints a very different picture from Monster. And it's a very different Aileen. If you're trying to understand her and why she committed her crimes, it's a very different Aileen. If the first murder was triggered by her trying to save her own life during a rape, that's a very different Aileen from an Aileen who robbed and killed men so there would be no witnesses, which she admitted was the case.
So your issue with the movie is as well that there would be no possible way of misinterpreting the information and the evidence that came out at trial and that was published in books like yourself, your book.
What they did, Dan, was to say it was based on the true story, a true story.
Sure.
Now, to me, if you're going to change the core of who Aileen Wournos is, because she is quite an important figure in terms of the crime world and what we learn about the criminal mind, how these crimes are committed and why, then why not change her name in the film too? There was another critical difference, which was that Tyria was very much aware of what was going on. She was sharing in the spoils of these robberies. She was taking the men's watches and jackets and things that Aileen would bring home and wearing them and what have you. In the movie, they painted her, the Christina Ricci character, as this sort of little innocent who knew nothing about what was going on. Well, that wasn't true. There was also a lot made of Ty trying to get away from Aileen once she became afraid of her. But right before the last murder, before the arrest, Ty had gone to Ohio for Thanksgiving to the family, and she'd come back. Now, if she was afraid for her life, why did she get on the bus and come back?
Certainly.
Yeah. So these are core differences, don't you think?
Yeah, those are, like you say, there is the truth, and then there's fiction, and so the movie is fiction.
It's not alone, of course, in being based on a true story and then taking massive liberties with the real story. The trouble is, the public at large, see the movie, and I've done it myself, God knows, many times, whether it was, a film about Nixon or Kennedy or whatever, you take it at its face value, and that's what many people have done with Aileen. But what has been the fallout from all this, Dan, is that the press, and by that I mean the newspapers from day one, began referring to her victims as her Johns and painting them as, rapists who brutalized her. Now, in actual fact, two men, I think, had clothing off, and that, of course, does indicate a sexual transaction. But we also know, because of men who testified and men I interviewed, that Aileen traveled with a photograph of children, and she would flag down cars, and she would say, I need to get back to my motel. My children are there. They're hungry. I've got to get back. Can you give me a ride? And I think it's fair to say that some of these men actually were good Samaritans and gave her a ride,
Sure.
It's not fair to blanketly attack the victims. Imagine if the boot were on the other foot. Imagine if these victims were women killed by a male serial killer, and if the press were to, badmouth them. Without firm evidence to the contrary, I think we have to give the men the benefit of the doubt. Okay, if they were nude, yes, sex was happening. That much we can assume. But we know from other witnesses that she had this MO, and she'd get in the car and then she'd try to rob men. We have men who, kind of parked at a gas station to get gas, sent her in to buy some cigarettes or whatever, and drove off because they found her so scary. And those men survived the encounter, as most did, of course, but also testified to the fact that she'd scared the living bejesus out of them, and that's what she'd done. She'd asked for a ride to get back to her children. So you imagine the pain of these families. Not only is their loved one murdered, assuming that probably, at least 3 or 4 of the 7 were nice guys, but he's labeled as a sort of rapist monster. Yeah.
I find it incredible, too. I agree with you, because I've seen the same thing where a fair amount of information concerning the victims comes from the only last living witness, which is the killer. It's in herself interest to demonize the victim, and so, like you say, the family gets to hear an account of their loved one, which is based on the self-interest of the killer trying to demonize the victim to their own benefit. And then the media, again, is irresponsible, I think, or ignorant, or a combination of both, putting too much credence in a defense lawyer's assertions, which, again, come from the killer themselves. I think that they're inexperienced, otherwise they wouldn't put that much credence to what a defense lawyer says on behalf of their client.
Well, as you know, and I mean, we're all guilty of this to some extent as journalists, you look up what's been printed before, and you're in a rush, you're on a deadline, and things get repeated. But these men became her Johns, and that was a shorthand way of saying something that would fit in a very brief number of words, which is often a challenge as a journalist. But I think that it would be more accurate to say the men who picked her up as a hitchhiker. The other thing is that you don't very often read about the fact that she went out with this bottle of Windex and the gun in the bag every day. Now, okay, I can see the gun, self-protection, but why would you carry Windex? Now, sure. The cars were wiped clean of fingerprints. You know, this was not a sudden thing out of the blue. There was some pre-planning here.
Sure.
And self-protection on her part, but not against the men, against being identified.
Now, you talked about she was careful to wipe off her fingerprints to not be detected for these murders.
Mm-hmm.
How did Aileen eventually get caught by police?
Well, at the pawn shop, by law, you have to give a fingerprint. And unlike some of the criminals who are out there today who've had their fingerprints sanded off or chemically altered, Eileen's fingerprints were Eileen's fingerprints. And in those days, fingerprints were hand sorted. You know, they were on cards. There was no computerized whatever. But eventually, by good old-fashioned police work, items at a pawn shop where she had left her honest-to-God fingerprint on the card, tied together, and she had a record. She had a criminal record, and so once that fingerprint was found with the pawned items that tied with missing items from the men who died, then the gig was up. And at that point, the police went after Tyria because they felt she was the less culpable. They had no real evidence that Tyria was present at any of the murders. She had alibis for a couple of the days, for example. So they got hold of Tyria first, and basically she gave her cooperation and wore a hidden wire and telephoned Aileen, who'd been picked up on an outstanding gun warrant and was in jail, and said, you know, they're on to us, they know what you've done, I'm not going down for what you've done. And a series of, you know, very poignant phone calls were taped. And I say poignant because Aileen said, you know, I love you, you know I'm not going to let you go down for something you didn't do. And ultimately Aileen did confess, and you might say she confessed to save Tyria.
And that was the gist of those phone calls as well?
Yeah. It took a while to build up to that, but Aileen was suspicious. She said, are you sure there's nobody else there in the room with you, etc.? But briefed by the police, I think I'm going to say there were 7, 9, or 11, sorry, but it has been a long time, taped telephone calls, and they accelerated. The police were saying, come on, put more pressure on her. Say that you're going to be arrested, and Ty was sort of more emotional with her on the phone. They think I did it, you know, they know who we are. There was a composite sketch done by an artist, they know it's us, you know, this sort of thing. And she convinced Aileen that she was going to be arrested, and Aileen said, look, I won't let that happen, and basically, you know, said, I want to talk to a detective or whatever, and out came the 3-hour original confession.
Now, at trial, did Tyra testify against Aileen Wournos?
Yes, she did.
Was that the testimony effective? And was there anything revealed at the trial that she didn't reveal in, say, those phone calls? You attended the trial. Tell us a little bit about that testimony.
Yeah, you know, for me, we are talking about 1991 here, so I don't want everyone to think I'm an amnesiac, but it's a long time since I first wrote this book and since I attended the trial. But what I remember most was Ty came in, she'd been very cleaned up, she was wearing a sort of, she always dressed very butch and T-shirt and jeans and what have you. She was wearing an outfit, and it was a patterned, you know, outfit. And with a skirt, I think, and maybe it was a pantsuit, but anyway, a print, and had her hair cut and everything. And Eileen's eyes did not leave her as she walked to the stand and as she took the stand, but Ty did not once make eye contact back. And Aileen was obviously waiting for this, for them to make eye contact. And she was devastated that Ty testified against her, absolutely devastated. And I think only then did it really hit her that Ty was as instrumental as she was in what was going down for Aileen.
Right. Now, in the book, it's another fascinating aspect of the story that Aileen Wournos' life and her need for celebrity and notoriety don't end, and there are some other people that come into her circle of influence there, we'll say. And tell us about Arlene Prale.
Arlene Prale, yes. Arlene Prale is a Christian woman who claimed that she saw Aileen on television and felt this calling, looked into her eyes and knew that she was innocent and felt this calling to go and see her. And eventually, in order to facilitate the visits, she did adopt Aileen. Arlene adopted Aileen because that gave her more access to her in jail. So there was this adoption, and for a time they were incredibly close, but by the time Aileen was executed, I rang Arlene Prale, who by then was no longer living in Florida and was living on an island somewhere. And I rang her, and she didn't know about the execution. I sort of broke that news to her. She had not even heard. But that's how their relationship was at that point. They were no longer talking.
Now, another figure is a Jacqueline Garreau. Maybe you can tell us who she was and what her position was in this big story.
Jackie Giroux is a film producer, and actually I'd known her. I lived in Hollywood, and I'd known Jackie for a long time, casually, Okay. And Jackie, well, it's a bit of a convoluted story, but she had a house guest who was a friend of her, both of us. And I rang the house that day and asked to speak to the house guest, and she said, "Sue, it's me, And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm going to make a movie about this woman, Aileen Wournos. And so why don't you write a book about her?" And so that's really how that came about. So Jackie Giroux was hot on the trail of this from the minute of the arrest, flew to Florida and signed up movie rights with Aileen through a lawyer. And, of course, it then all got much more complicated. And, basically Aileen was very much wanting money. She always wanted money. It's funny, this morning I read on Pointer that ABC News, I believe it's ABC News, I can check while we're talking, had paid $200,000 to the Casey Anthony family for video and pictures.
Right.
Well, similarly, news organizations were paying Aileen money, $10,000 here, $10,000 there. It wasn't the big bucks that ABC paid to the Casey Anthony family, but she was getting this money, and she lorded it over her team outside the prison. Basically said, okay, this much goes to this one, and this much goes to that one, and she exercised control from behind bars over these people. And Arlene Prale was, was top of the list, because of course Aileen couldn't receive the money herself, or at least only a limited amount for her tuck shop purchases or whatever they're allowed in the prison account.
Did Jackie Giroux end up making the movie?
Jackie Giroux did make a movie, but she had a lot of troubles with it because, first of all, while I was writing the book, CBS rushed out a TV movie starring Jean Smart, which was as inaccurate as you could wish in terms of painting Tyria again as unaware of the crimes and, what have you. And then, of course, along came Monster, and You'd have to ask Jackie Giroux herself about her movie journey, but it was quite a journey, and there were all kinds of ins and outs with people trying to stop and make the movie, and then there were issues of 3 police officers having an agreement with CBS where they would cooperate in the making of that first movie. And although ultimately it was not proven that they had taken money, and this was pre-trial, by the way, so this was pretty bad stuff.
Right.
I do have a copy of the draft letter of the agreement that the police officers were supposedly going to sign from that time, but it does not bear signatures, and I do believe that they backed out, but at the time they were being offered quite a chunk of change. And then there was somebody running around trying to sell transcripts of the confession, the 3-hour confession, before that was made, put in the public domain and was accessible to journalists like myself, and asking $10,000 for that. So it was a zoo, Dan. It was a zoo. It's the kind of zoo that we now see more commonly, with cases like Casey Anthony. But back then, it was a sort of standout zoo, if you will. And her greed for the money essentially, cut off my contact with her because I wasn't going to pay her. And, people like the news organizations and Montel Williams ended up getting much more access to her, and Nick Broomfield, the documentarian, because they did pay money.
I saw a program concerning Lee Wournos on American Justice, and I thought it was a fair program. It's a very reputable program as well. Not as well, but it is a reputable program, I should say.
Right.
And they do handle the cases in a very respectful and truthful way, I find so.
Yes.
Now, you said that she was ultimately sentenced to 6 death sentences. Was she executed? When was she executed?
Yes, she was executed. She was indeed, and totally coincidentally, within a month or so of my book coming out in America. And, that was, just looking to see if I can find the date here. But anyway, it was 2002. It was the fall of 2002. And, she was executed, and the last high-profile woman to have been executed, and I don't think any woman's been executed in Florida since Aileen, but I would have to check that. Ultimately, she gave up her appeals. She wanted to die. She wanted to go and be with God, and she had at the time a lawyer, Stephen Glazer, who honored and respected that wish of hers, which caused outrage in the legal community, who believed that, if a client says they want to die, you certainly don't help them on their way,
right.
Perhaps. I talked to Aileen very briefly the night before she got her first death sentence by telephone, and we spoke, and it was very apparent to me that she expected to get off. There wasn't a corner of her mind that thought she was going to be found guilty. She, cried on the witness stand. She told this horror story, but it didn't match the evidence, and of course she was found guilty. She was devastated, Dan. She was doubtless in a state of depression. She then got 3 more death sentences, which were, she pled out, basically. And
right.
So therefore there were sentencing hearings, and I attended those as well. And so she basically sort of caved in and said, look, okay, I did it. She didn't even fight. There wasn't another trial after the first trial. It was a no contest issue. And she did reach a point when she just wanted to give up the appeals. She had disintegrated emotionally. She was never the most stable person, as we've said. But on death row, she'd definitely gone downhill. But that said, she'd also embraced the Bible, embraced God, embraced her religion, believed she was going to a better place, and that was what she wanted. She'd had 10 years shut in a cell on her own, and it was like, enough already. I don't want any more of this. And so at that point, she dropped her appeals, and there were various hearings in front of judges to be sure that that was what she wanted, and eventually all was cleared and nothing further stood in the way of her execution, and it went ahead.
Now, do you think, you talk in your book extensively about the psychopathic mind of the serial killers that crave celebrity. They want the notoriety above almost anything else. Mm-hmm. You talked about her late embrace of Christianity, or later embrace before she died. Do you really believe that she enjoyed this entire, moment in the sun, her attention?
Yeah. Well, you have to look at it this way. She talked to Cammie Green about, do you want to get involved in something with me and Ty? We're going to be like Bonnie and Clyde. She kept talking about Bonnie and Clyde. Before she'd committed any of the murders we know about, she got hold of this chap who was a writer/coach driver, and had him come over to the motel that they were living in one evening because she wanted him to write her life story.
Right.
And he was so freaked out that he kind of fled from the motel and never to be seen again. When she was in jail, she talked about being, I'm Aileen Wournos of television. Wait till Geraldo hears about this. There was definitely some grandiosity, and yes, I do believe she wanted to be famous. I just don't think she believed it would end up the way it ended up. It's arguable, I guess, how conscious all of this was played into her thinking. I still believe that she was a robber who killed, but definitely she wanted fame. And back then, when she was a little more of sound mind, she pursued, think about it, before she'd done anything, she said, I'm going to tell you, to this author/coach driver, I'm going to tell you things that will make your hair stand on end, that things you've never heard before. I don't know. Was there more to tell? Right. We don't know. But this was before the first murder. What did she think this book was going to be about? What was she going to write a book about? I have no idea. But she wanted a book written about her. She wanted fame. She wanted, to be famous, for sure. And the Bonnie and Clyde fantasy was big with her and long-lasting.
Well, Sue, we just have about a minute left. I'd like to let people know that you've been talking about the book Lethal Intent, the shocking true story of one of America's most notorious female serial killers, Aileen Wournos. Maybe you can tell us what you're working on now and your website contact for anybody that's interested, please.
Yes, absolutely. Well, my website is www.Sue, S-U-E, Russell, R-U-S-S-E-L-L, Writes, WRITES.com, SueRussellWrites.com. What I'm working on now, wouldn't you like to know?
Yes, I would.
I actually am working on another crime book proposal, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that soon, but it's a bit premature right now. But I've been writing about wildfire technology for a wonderful website called millermccune.com. Just had a 5-part series with them on extreme wildfire fighting and the advances in computer imaging and mapping and what have you. And I've written about fingerprints and bias and all kinds of forensic stuff for non-books, for magazines and websites. So that's really been the most recent stuff.
Well, very interesting stuff. I want to thank you very much, Sue Russell. I want you to have a great day, and I want to thank you very much for this fascinating interview.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciated it, and I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it very much myself. You have a great day.
Okay,
take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. You're listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Good night.
Serial killer, as outlined by the FBI. So it just seemed crazy not to just immediately jump up and say, okay, this is the one. I have to write this book. I felt very much interested in women's violence. I'd written about women as victims of violence, and this was just too good to pass up in terms of being such a fascinating story, Dan.
Right. Now, I'm a little bit confused, and maybe you can tell our audience. You wrote Damsel of Death and also Lethal Intent. Are they two separate books? Tell us
I'm glad you asked that, because it does confuse people somewhat. What happened was I wrote Damsel of Death first for England and Australia. As you may be able to tell, I don't know if I have any of my accent left. I am a native Londoner. And so the book came out over there first, and due to various publishing industry hiccups, it didn't come out here until after 2000. What was it? 2002, I think.
Right.
And at that point, they put another title on it. It was exactly the same book, but I updated it with her 10 years on death row at the end. So Lethal Intent is definitely the one if anyone's interested in getting hold of the book, because it does go right up to, the point of her execution.
Yeah, okay. That clarifies that. I was interested.
A powerful influence on a person's future, then I think you could say that Aileen had a double dose of it.
Right.
The grandparents then raised Aileen and Keith as their own, and alongside their own children, Diane's brothers, Barry and Laurie. So it was Barry and Laurie and Aileen and Keith, as if they were all siblings, although in fact Barry and Laurie were aunt and uncle to Aileen and Keith. I hope I'm making sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was a rough childhood. It was a hard scrabble Michigan life. But Laurie Wournos, Lowry, I'm sorry, the father, we called him Lowry to try to distinguish from Laurie, the daughter. But Lowry Wournos was generally recognized in the neighborhood as a mean man, and neighbors would hear the kids getting a whipping from across the backyards and what have you, and hear screaming and carrying on. The shades were always drawn. They were a very private family. It was one of those cases of what is going on behind closed doors. And school kids who went to school with her would always said when I interviewed them years later, that they always assumed that bad things were happening and it was not a happy place to be living. But they kept all of it very much hidden. And grandmother,
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure. And I'm sure our audience is as well.
I hope so.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I'm certain. Now, first off, this is a question that always intrigues me, and I always ask it of all guests. You are, to give you a little bit of a background to our audience, you're an internationally syndicated journalist and author, a past editor of Woman Magazine, and a regular contributor to various British and U.S. publications. You've written about the beauty industry and co-authored Star Mothers, the mums behind the celebrities. Now, what was it about the Aileen Wournos case, because you've written about so many diverse cases, what was it about the Aileen Wournos case specifically that compelled you to write not only Lethal Intent, but also Damsel of Death, both about Aileen Wournos? What was it about Aileen Wournos and her case that interested you so much?
Well, I'd written a lot of crime stories and features on related issues about crime, and I was dying to write a true crime book, no pun intended. And the minute I heard about Aileen, of course my ears pricked up, because it was such an extraordinary case. It was such an amazing piece of news that was coming across the wires, this woman being arrested with all these casualties of her at the end of her 22 caliber gun, and it was in modern day times unprecedented, and she defied the definitions of a...
Hello, this is your host, Dan Zapaski, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. On November 30th, 1989, in Florida, a man was shot 4 times by a naked, hard-faced, blonde prostitute. He suffered a slow, agonizing death, while the woman stripped him of his valuables and drove his Cadillac back to the motel where her lesbian lover was waiting. In 1990, her killing spree kicked into high gear, with 3 men slain in 3 weeks. Of the 6 of 7 male victims whose bodies were found, some were nude. All had been robbed and shot dead. In January 1991, pawnshop records led to the arrest of Aileen Carol Wournos, a.k.a. Lee, an abusive alcoholic man-hater with a murderous hair-trigger temper. Tired of turning $20 tricks and often being abused, Wournos decided to rob her customers of everything they had, including their lives. Her arrest and trial prompted a worldwide media frenzy and even an Academy Award-winning movie, Monster. In the end, Wournos received 6 separate death sentences. Lethal Intent is the definitive account of a killer who confounded the profiling experts, forever changing their concepts of the crimes of which a woman is capable. My guest today is journalist and author Sue Russell, discussing her true crime classic, Lethal Intent, the shocking true story of one of America's most notorious female serial killers. Welcome to the program, Sue Russell, and thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you for having me on the show.
To know about that.
Yes,
it would seem unusual that you would write 2 separate books about the same thing.
Right.
Now, I understand that you've spent some 2 years researching the life of Aileen Wournos. It is a fascinating story just on its own. Let's go back. What was Aileen Wournos' early life like growing up in Troy, Michigan, just outside of the city of Detroit?
Right. Just to clarify, I didn't spend 2 years researching it. I spent 2 years researching and writing it. I don't want people to think I'm the slowest person in the Western Hemisphere. Aileen was born to Diane Wournos, who was briefly married to Leo Pittman. They were both very young, and this was in Troy, Michigan. And basically what happened is, first there was the brother Keith, who's about 11 months older than Aileen, and then Aileen was born, by which time Leo Pittman had exited the picture. And within the first 2 years of Aileen's life, her mother abandoned her twice, dumping her and Keith on the grandparents, Britta and Lowry Wournos, also in the Troy, Michigan area there. And so she left the babies with the grandparents once, and then she came back and tried to make a go of it, but that didn't work, and so she took off twice. So for anyone who believes, that abandonment during that very early formative stage is